On the morning of April 22nd, 1988, in Crawford County, Arkansas, a logging contractor named Rick Boatner drove his new Cat D6 Dozer off the lowboy trailer at the edge of Doyle Garrett's timber sale and drove it straight into the bottomland and sank it to its belly in 45 minutes. The ground was the problem. It had rained in Crawford County for 11 of the previous 16 days, the kind of sustained wet April that the Ozarks produced every few years, when the hills shed water faster than the creek flats could carry it, and the bottomland turned from firm black earth into something that looked solid from the surface and behaved like cold pudding 6 inches down. The kind of ground that experienced timber operators in that part of Arkansas knew by sight and by smell and by the specific sound your boot made when you stepped on it. Rick Boatner was not from Crawford County. He ran his logging operation out of Fort Smith, 40 miles to the south, and he had been contracting timber sales across 3 counties for 12 years. He was good at his work on the upland sites, on the red clay slopes and the ridge tops where the hardwoods grew thick and a D6 could work all day without drama. He was less good at reading bottomland in wet springs, not because he was careless, but because the bottomland jobs on his usual territory were not like this one. This one had the creek flat. 60 acres of timber sitting above a bottomland creek flat that had been soaking in 2 weeks of rain. Rick had looked at it from the hillside and made a judgment. The flat was wet, but passable. He had crossed worse. The D6 could handle it. The D6 could not handle it. By 10 in the morning, the dozer was sitting with its belly pan resting on the saturated ground, both tracks spinning uselessly in the black soup, going nowhere. Rick shut it down and stood beside it and looked at the situation. He called his equipment manager. He called a heavy equipment recovery company in Van Buren. He called 2 other contractors he knew in the area. He got 3 callbacks and 3 versions of the same answer. Getting a machine like this out of soft bottomland required equipment that could work without adding to the problem, and the available options in Crawford County that morning were either too far away, too expensive, or would make the situation worse by adding more weight to already destroyed ground. Then someone on Rick's crew mentioned the old machine in the shed up at the Garrett place. Rick had passed that machine twice on his drive in. He had seen it through the open shed doors, sitting on its wooden blocks, an antique crawler tractor so small and so old that he had assumed it was decorative, something a man kept because his grandfather had owned it. He drove to the farmhouse. Let me tell you about Doyle Garrett, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he kept in that shed. Doyle was 61 years old in the spring of 1988. He had been farming and timber cutting in Crawford County his entire adult life, the way his father had before him and his grandfather Harmon before that. The Garrett family had worked the same 200 acres on the eastern edge of the Boston Mountains since 1911. 200 acres of Ozark Hill country is not a lot of ground. It is enough to make a living on if you know it completely, if you understand every slope and every hollow and every acre of soft bottom land along the creek. Doyle knew this ground the way he knew his own hands. He had been on it since he could walk. He had also been on the 1929 Caterpillar 20 since he was 12 years old. Let me tell you about Harmon Garrett and why he bought that Caterpillar in the spring of 1929, because that decision and the reasoning behind it is the whole story. Harmon was 40 years old in 1929 and had been farming and timber cutting in Crawford County for 20 years. He knew the Ozark bottomland the way every man in that county eventually learned it, by sinking into it. The creek flats along Frog Bayou were some of the richest soil in the county when they were dry, and some of the most treacherous when they were wet. Every wet spring, the equipment went in and the equipment got stuck, and someone spent a week getting it out. Harmon had dragged mules out of that bottomland. He had watched his father's neighbor lose a team of draft horses in a mud flat in 1907, the horses panicking and going down before anyone could reach them. He understood ground pressure the way farmers understood it before there were engineers to put numbers on it. He understood it from watching what sank and what did not. Heavy things sink into soft ground. Light things do not. Simple. When the Caterpillar Company introduced the 20 model in 1927, a small crawler designed for orchard and light clearing work, Harmon had paid attention to its specifications. The 20 weighed 4,800 pounds, very light for a crawler, and it spread that weight across a long track contact area that put only 4 pounds per square inch of pressure on whatever ground it was crossing. Harmon had watched draft horses work in bottomland. He knew his mule team averaged 10 to 12 pounds per square inch under each hoof when loaded. 4 pounds per square inch across a long track was better than anything he had used on that bottomland. He drove to Fayetteville in the spring of 1929 and paid $1,800 for a new Caterpillar 20. That was most of what he had. 3 years of careful saving. He brought it home and put it in the shed. His neighbors thought he was crazy. Not all of them. The older ones who had been in that bottomland as long as Harmon mostly nodded and said nothing. But the younger ones looked at the little machine and at the $1,800 Harmon had spent and made the kind of calculations that did not account for the specific problem Harmon was solving. "Why not just wait for the ground to dry?" someone asked at the feed store. "Because the timber does not wait," Harmon said. "The price does not wait. The contract does not wait." He went back to work. He put the 20 to work in the bottomland that first summer, and it did what he had calculated it would do. It crossed ground that his horses avoided and his neighbor's equipment sank in. It moved timber off the creek flat in wet conditions that shut down every other operation in the county. It was not powerful, 25 horsepower, modest even by 1929 standards, but it was light and it gripped and it kept moving where heavier machines could not follow. Harmon used the 20 for 30 years. He taught his son Leonard to run it. Leonard taught Doyle. By the time Doyle took over the farm in 1971, the 20 was 42 years old, and Doyle had been running it for 30 of those years. He maintained it the way Harmon had maintained it. Annual inspection, new track pins when the wear reached a certain point, carburetor service every 2 years whether it needed it or not. The machine sat on wooden blocks in the shed when it was not working, keeping the track weight off the floor and the tension even. By 1988, the 20 was 59 years old. It still started on the 3rd or 4th crank. It still ran smooth, and it still had a ground pressure of 4 pounds per square inch, which was the same as it had always been, and which was the number that mattered today. Now let me tell you about Rick Boatner, because you need to understand what he had before you can understand what he needed to borrow. Rick had built his logging operation from a single skidder and a borrowed truck in 1976 into a full-service timber harvesting company with 6 pieces of equipment, 4 trucks, and 12 employees by 1988. He was good at the work. What he understood less well was the ground under his machines, not because he was ignorant, but because the D6 had never failed him before. In 12 years on the jobs he typically ran, the D6 had never sunk. He had no personal history with soft bottomland of this specific type, the Ozark Creek flat bottomland that looked passable from the edge and became something else entirely once you were on it with 60,000 pounds of steel. He had assumed the D6 could handle it because the D6 had always handled everything else. His experience had not included ground like this. When he drove to the Garrett farmhouse at 11 that morning, Rick was a man who had been made humble by physics in under an hour. Doyle was on the porch when Rick pulled in. He had heard the D6 go down from where he was working on a fence line 3/4 of a mile away. He had heard it the way a man hears a heavy machine lose its footing in soft ground, a specific change in the engine note and the track sound that carries through the hills on a quiet morning. He had walked back to the farmhouse, poured a cup of coffee, and sat in his porch chair to wait. He had expected someone would show up. Rick parked and got out and walked to the porch steps. He still had his hard hat on. "Mr. Garrett," he said, "I understand you have a small crawler up here." Doyle looked at him. "I have my grandfather's 1929 Cat 20, he said. "Yes." Rick looked at the machine shed where the 20 sat visible through the open doors. He was a man who had dismissed that machine twice on his drive in, and he was now standing on this porch, needing it. "I have a D6 in your bottomland," Rick said. "It went down in the creek flat." "I heard it go," Doyle said. Rick looked at him. "I need to recover my machine and finish the timber sale." He paused. "I think that Cat 20 might be the only machine that can work that ground right now." "What do you need?" Doyle said. "I need to pull my D6 out of that flat, and I need to get the bottomland timber off the creek acres." Doyle set his coffee down. "How deep is the D6? Belly pan on the ground, both tracks spinning. Doyle looked at the creek flat visible in the distance through the tree line. "That ground is going to stay soft for 2 weeks, he said, "with the rain coming Thursday." Rick nodded. "I know. The 20 can pull your machine out," Doyle said, "and it can work the creek timber after." He looked at Rick. "It will take time. That machine moves at 3 miles an hour in good conditions. In that bottomland, it will move slower." He paused. "It will move, though." Rick looked at him. "What do you want for it?" Doyle looked at Rick for a long moment. "Nothing," he said. "You are working my timber sale. It is my creek flat that held your machine." He stood up. "Come back at noon. I will have it running." Rick started to say something about payment. "Come back at noon," Doyle said again. He went inside. "Let me pause here and tell you something about ground pressure, because you cannot understand what the 20 was about to do without understanding the physics that had stopped the D6. Ground pressure is the force a machine exerts on the surface it crosses, expressed in pounds per square inch. It is calculated by dividing the machine's weight by the area of its track contact with the ground. A machine that exerts high ground pressure sinks into soft soil because the force under its tracks exceeds the shear strength of the saturated earth. The soil cannot resist and fails, swallowing the track. The Cat D6 in 1988 weighed approximately 36,000 pounds. Its track contact area gave it a ground pressure of around 8 to 10 pounds per square inch on typical soil. On dry Ozark bottomland, that was fine. On 2-week, saturated creek flat soil with a water table 2 inches below the surface, it was not fine. The soil's shear strength under those conditions was approximately 4 to 6 pounds per square inch. The D6 was asking the ground to carry twice what it could hold. Physics answered accordingly. The 1929 Caterpillar 20 weighed 4,800 pounds. Its extended track contact area produced a ground pressure of approximately 4 pounds per square inch. On the same saturated bottomland, it was asking the soil to carry almost exactly what the soil could hold. Not comfortably, but enough to keep moving. Harmon Garrett had understood this in 1929 without the equations. He had understood it from watching what sank and what did not. The difference between 4 pounds per square inch and 8 pounds per square inch does not sound dramatic. On a dry ground, it is meaningless. On saturated Ozark bottomland in April, it is the difference between a machine that works and a machine that becomes part of the ground it was supposed to be working. Doyle knew this. He had known it since he was 12. Rick Boatner had not known it. He knew it now. Now let me tell you about what the 20 did that afternoon, because that is the part of this story that timber crews in Crawford County still talk about. Doyle had the 20 running by noon. He drove it down to the bottomland at 2 miles an hour, the small machine making its distinctive sound on the track, a rhythmic clinking of the links that everyone at the job site stopped to listen to when they heard it coming through the trees. Rick's crew was at the edge of the creek flat when Doyle arrived. 5 men. They had been standing at the edge looking at the stuck D6 for 2 hours. They looked at Doyle on the 20 coming down through the timber, and they had the reaction that people always had when they saw that machine for the first time. They looked at each other. A couple of them smiled. One of them said, "Is that thing going to pull a D6 out, or is it going to keep it company down there?" Doyle did not answer. He drove to the edge of the flat and stopped. He got off and walked out onto the bottomland, testing the surface with each step, reading the guive under his boots, checking the water seep around each footprint. He walked out 40 feet and came back. He looked at the path to the D6 and the angles available for a pull. He went back to the 20 and uncoiled the cable from the back. Heavy steel cable, 3/4 inch diameter, 50 feet of it. He walked the cable out to the D6, hooked it to the front tow point, walked back to the 20 paying cable as he went. He positioned the machine on the firmest ground available, at an angle that would bring the D6 out along the path of least resistance. He engaged the winch. The 20 pulled, not explosively, not with the dramatic roar of a big machine throwing full power at a problem. It pulled the way a heavy sled dog pulls, steadily, continuously, without giving the ground a reason to give up what it was holding. The D6 moved, an inch at first, then 6 inches. The mud made a sound releasing it, a long sucking exhale, then a foot, then 2. The 20 kept pulling, track links clicking, engine working at a steady note that did not change whether the load was light or heavy. In 22 minutes, the D6 was out of the hole and on firm ground. Rick's crew had not said anything since the pull started. They had watched the 20 work in silence, and they had watched it, because what they were seeing did not match what they had expected to see. Rick walked out to where Doyle was unhooking the cable. "That was faster than I thought," Rick said. "It was not in as deep as some I have pulled," Doyle said. Rick looked at the 20, then he looked at his D6. He was a man who dealt in numbers, and the numbers here were not cooperating with anything he had believed before today. "Can it work the creek timber?" Rick asked. "That is what we are going to find out," Doyle said. He got back on the 20 and drove it to the edge of the creek timber stand. Now let me tell you what happened over the next 4 days, because that is where the story earns its full weight. The creek flat timber was mature white oak and hickory, mixed with short-leaf pine on the slightly elevated ground near the water. Good timber. Rick's skidder and loader were on the upland portion working the hillside timber without trouble. The bottomland timber was staying where it was until someone could get into the flat to cut and move it. Doyle figured it out the way Harmon had figured it out 60 years earlier. He went in light. He went in slow. He read the ground with every pass and adjusted the path when the 20 told him through its behavior that the soil was changing beneath him. He felled the trees himself with a chainsaw, working in the flat while the 20 sat on the firmest ground he could find. He cut each tree to length on the ground. Then he used the 20 to skid the logs to the flat's edge, where Rick's loader could reach them without entering the soft ground. It was not efficient by the standards of modern timber harvesting. It was slow and careful and deliberate, the way all work in soft bottomland has to be. The 20 sank slightly with heavier loads, track links deepening into the wet soil by an inch or two, but it kept moving. It did not stop. It did not create the track-spinning cycle that indicated a machine losing its fight with the ground. It gripped and pulled and moved and gripped again. Rick watched from the edge of the flat on the first day, making notes and not saying much. On the second day, his foreman came to stand beside him. "How old did you say that machine was?" the foreman asked. 59 years, Rick said. The foreman watched the 20 work for a while. He shook his head slowly. By the third day, 2 of the crew members had started timing Doyle's skidding cycles, not to evaluate efficiency, but out of the specific fascination that comes from watching something do what it should not be able to do. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the last of the bottomland timber was at the landing. Rick's loader had processed it all and the trucks had hauled. Doyle shut the 20 down at the flat edge and climbed off. Rick walked over. His hard hat was off. He had stopped wearing it on the 3rd day. He held out his hand. Doyle shook it. "What does it cost to run?" Rick asked. "That machine. Per hour." Doyle thought about it. "Diesel, parts when they wear my time. Maybe $4 an hour when I figure it over the year." Rick looked at the 20. His D6 cost approximately $85 an hour in fuel and maintenance alone, not counting the loan payment. He looked at the hole the D6 had made in the creek flat, already beginning to fill with groundwater. "You knew my machine would go down," Rick said, "when you looked at the ground from the hillside before we started." Doyle was quiet for a moment. "I knew the ground," he said. "I did not know your machine." "But yes. Why did you not say something?" Doyle looked at him. He picked up his cable and began coiling it over his arm. "You did not ask," Doyle said. Rick had no answer for that. He stood there for a moment, and then he laughed. Not the quick, confident laugh he had arrived with 9 days ago. A different kind of laugh. The kind a man produces when the truth of something lands cleanly. If you want to know what Rick Boatner did after he drove out of the Garrett farm that afternoon and what he did differently on every bottomland job he took for the rest of his career, subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever been taught something important by a piece of equipment that everyone around you dismissed as obsolete. Rick called Doyle 3 weeks later. He had another timber sale in Scott County with a creek bottom that had similar conditions. He wanted to know if Doyle and the 20 were available to work the bottom acres. Doyle said yes. They worked together on 4 more jobs over the following 3 years. Rick always handled the upland timber with his modern equipment. Doyle always handled the bottomland with the 20. The division of labor was never formally discussed. It just became the arrangement because it was the arrangement that worked. On the second job, Rick brought his foreman out to watch Doyle work the bottomland. On the third job, he brought his equipment operator. He was not doing it to show off the novelty of the old machine. He was doing it because he had understood something on that April morning in 1988. And he wanted his crew to understand it too. Ground pressure, Rick told his operator on the third job, watching the 20 work a saturated creek flat, is not a problem you solve with more horsepower. It is a problem you solve before you buy the machine. His operator looked at the 20 moving through ground his D6 would have gone through like a rock through a pond. He looked at it for a long time. "How do you solve it before you buy the machine?" he asked. "You talk to the old farmer who has been working that ground since before you were born," Rick said, "before you decide his equipment is too old to be worth your time. Let me tell you about the years after, because this story does not end at a creek flat." Doyle Garrett retired from active timber cutting in 1994 at the age of 67. His son Gary had been working the farm since 1989 and took over the timber operation fully when Doyle's back finally said enough. The 20 went with the farm. Gary had learned to run it the same way Doyle had learned, the same way Leonard had learned from Harmon. He maintained it on the same schedule Harmon had written in the composition notebook in 1934. He kept it on its wooden blocks in the shed when it was not working. He used it every wet spring. There was always a wet spring. Rick Boatner contracted 3 more timber sales on the Garrett property between 1994 and 2003. He always left the bottomland acres for Gary and the 20. He had stopped laughing at old machines in 1988, and he never went back to it. In 2004, Rick sold his logging operation and retired to Fort Smith. Before he left the business, he bought a used crawler tractor for the small jobs he still intended to take on in retirement. He did not buy a modern machine. He bought a 1947 Caterpillar D2, which was the closest thing available to the 20's operating philosophy, light and low ground pressure, and old enough that it had been built before the engineering priority shifted from ground sensitivity to raw production capacity. He called Doyle to tell him. "Harmon would have approved," Doyle said. "How do you know what my grandfather would have approved of?" Rick asked. "You never met him." "No," Doyle said, "but I know what he understood." He paused. "Ground pressure is not a problem you solve with horsepower. It is a problem you solve before you buy the machine." Rick laughed. He had said that himself 3 years earlier to his equipment operator. He had not realized Doyle had heard him. "I heard you tell your operator," Doyle said. "It was the right thing to tell him. Let me tell you the last thing, because it is what Harmon would have wanted you to know. The 1929 Caterpillar 20 is still in the shed at the Garrett farm. Gary's son James farms the place now. Third generation since Doyle, fourth generation on the same Crawford County ground. James still runs the 20 in the bottomland every spring that is wet enough to need it. He knows the machine the way the Garretts have always known it, from the inside out, from the sound it makes and the feel of the controls and the way it tells you through its behavior what the ground beneath it is doing. The machine weighs 4,800 pounds. Its ground pressure is 4 pounds per square inch. Those numbers have not changed in 95 years, and they will not change because the physics of soft ground has not changed and will not change. Modern dozers can do things that Harmon Garrett's 20 cannot do. They can move more dirt faster. They can push bigger timber. They are better machines for most of the work that dozer operators do. But in the Ozark bottomland in a wet spring, when the creek flat has been soaking for 2 weeks and the water table is 2 inches below the surface, the 1929 Caterpillar 20 does something that no modern dozer in Rick Boatner's inventory was ever able to do. It keeps moving. Harmon Garrett understood that in 1929, when he drove to Fayetteville with $1,800 in his pocket and came home with a machine that his neighbors called too small to be useful. He understood it before the engineers had equations for it, before the logging contractors had job site data on it, before anyone had given it a name. He understood it the way a man understands a thing he has been trying to solve for 20 years, by paying attention, by not accepting the easy answer, by asking the right question, which was not how much horsepower do I need, but how light does the machine need to be. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the machines built for specific problems that everyone else ignored, of the knowledge that lives in old equipment and the families that keep it running not out of sentiment, but out of the clear-eyed understanding that the problem has not changed. Hit the bell so you do not miss the next one, and tell me in the comments, have you ever watched a machine do something that nothing newer around it could do? I want to hear about it. The 20 is still in the shed. The ground pressure is still 4 pounds per square inch. The bottomland is still soft in wet springs. Some problems have not changed since 1929, and neither have the machines that solve them.